So sovereignty, it was easily the most key word that happened in 2016, especially around the referendum. But of course, as we've discussed at length before, the Brexiteers didn't really understand what sovereignty means in the modern world. To them, it just meant that Brussels would no longer, quote, have control over making our laws. But as we've said before, even if you just look at how the EU made laws, we had tons of input how those laws were made, how those laws were implemented, and we could always choose, if we wanted to veto those laws. We had that power, but we didn't, because we knew that being in the EU, being part of those systems, was good for our economy and ultimately good for the UK. And now that we're out of the EU, as of many economists have said before, when you do trade agreements, one of the things you give up in modern trade agreements is sovereignty, because you share sovereignty. And ultimately, one of the biggest success stories easily of the 20th century is the European Union, a continent that was being constantly at war, is now at peace and doing and working together for not only the benefit of one country, but for the whole. And it has proved time and time again to be incredibly robust, active, and incredibly attractive to, outward investment and, economically. And now we have left that. And now we're on our own. And as always, Brexit is just not going as well as the Brexiteers like to say. So, as we jump into today's article, please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below there is a link to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you to all those people who do support me that way. So, today's article comes from the Yorkshire Bylines, and the title is, "How is reclaiming of sovereignty going after 100 days of Brexit?" Since Brexit happened, those who campaigned for it have shown very little attachment to and only the faintest memory of the benefits promised. The one exception is reclaiming our sovereignty. Others, such as reducing immigration, reviving our fishing industry, and economic benefits, have all evaporated. Admittedly, we weren't promised any specific economic benefits. Johnson indiscreetly just said F businesses, and the aspiration was quite a rare pointer. And credit where credit's due, it's really mission accomplished. So what about reclaiming sovereignty? After 100 days of Brexit, we must examine the reality of reclaiming sovereignty. The findings reveal a government that has routinely abused the notion of taking back control to undermine, exploit and obfuscate the processes of parliamentary sovereignty and democratic principles that underpin it, while at the same time the promised Brexit dividends of reclaimed national sovereignty are all falling apart. British sovereignty is a very slippery notion that has evolved over the centuries. Magna Carta in 1215 played an early role in shaping our ideas of sovereignty. The barons under King John recognised that people needed protecting from tyrannical monarchs who could both make all the laws and also ignore them, a case of too much sovereignty being a bad thing. Over time, British monarchs became ever more subject to the law and relieved of their absolute power. The present Queen does still retain some nominal clout, though, through the royal prerogative. But the defining power of government ministers to enact law depends now on parliamentary approval, hence the term parliamentary sovereignty. So now, other than in a narrow range of circumstances, we have parliamentary sovereignty, whereby elected MPs representing the interests of their country and their constituents have the power to endorse, restrict, or reject laws proposed by the government. We also have acceptable standards of behaviour for holders of public office in the form of the Nolan Principles, specifically for the government ministers in the Ministerial Code. In other words, governments can in principle be held to account. However, this Conservative government does not like to be held to account. What we are seeing is an excessive flush with a large is an executive flush with a large majority intent on securing central control and contemptuous of normal rules of parliamentary sovereignty. In the early post-Brexit strike, Jacob Rees-Mogg disbanded the only parliamentary committee with a brief to scrutinise Brexit outcomes. He now shows no interest of reviving a process for reviewing its implementation. In response, a group of MPs and business people has set up an independent commission. However, it carries no official weight. Patel's Police, Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill was a further attempt to minimise scrutiny. Presented to Parliament with only 7 days' notice, it includes barely concealed erosions of rights to protest, pandering to those who don't want their cosy worldview to be disturbed too much of reality for any inconvenience, restricting protests to places and methods that no one will notice, neuters the point of protests, more evidence of the government's aversion to being held to account. Now Patel is proposing legislation requiring first past the post voting in all mayoral elections from 2024. Her grounds are that FTP clarifies accountability. So we can expect more enforcement of first past the post, which hands Tories more control while giving voters less representation. The people most in need of a voice could soon be without one, as Patel intends by the end of 2021 to legislate for voter ID for all UK elections. This argument is supposedly to prevent election fraud, a practice so rare as to be completely inconsequential. Those voters least likely to possess ID are the ones least likely to vote Tory. Again, more control over the government, less for the voter. Further evidence for how government accountability is being suppressed is the freedom of information requests put to the government departments are now directed to a clearinghouse system overseen by Michael Gove, and response times to requests have increased, and the tactic of not acknowledging request receives means that follow-up efforts are now thwarted. In addition to passing legislation that tightens its grip on control, the government is also pushing against the limitation on standards of conduct. Handing COVID-related contracts to donors, friends and neighbours is a prime example of the misuse of power. And there's no side of the government being held to account in Parliament for clear examples of irresponsible and wasteful commissioning. They say it's far too early to be conducting reviews into their handling of the pandemic. No doubt that once it's not far too early, it will be far too late. 11 ministers have unequivocally broken the ministerial code, mostly for lack of openness and dishonesty. Matt Hancock has been found guilty of breaking the law on procurement for the NHS immunity and an immunity from any consequences of improper behaviour is a licence for further cavalier behaviour. Patel was found guilty by an inquiry of bullying staff in a direct contradiction to the rules of ministerial codes established for themselves in the ministerial code. Johnson then absolved her of all wrongdoing and invited the cabinet to rally round her. The ministerial code isn't legally binding, so there's no recourse that exists in law. Just in the last week, 2 immigration court judges have ruled that Patel's decision to deport a potential witness to death in custody was unlawful. On the other hand, then, we have the processes of parliamentary and democratic sovereignty being eroded. On the other hand, we have a national sovereignty promised by the Brexit campaign that is being exposed as a complete illusion. Thousands of small and medium-sized businesses traded very profitably as EU members, but they were persuaded to reclaiming sovereignty would mean a brighter future. Bureaucracy and tariff barriers have meant that 1 in 4 small businesses have now suspended trade with the EU. Others followed and swallowed the irony that followed the government's advice for them to move there. Some now face financial ruin. Try telling businesses affected by Brexit that reclaiming sovereignty is an automatic benefit. And Lord Frost declared that Johnson's unilateral decision to delay the implementation of border checks agreed in the Northern Ireland Protocol is an expression of our newly gained sovereignty. Johnson was then reminded that sovereignty used to justify breaking international agreements does not wash with the US. President Biden has said that any UK-US trade deal is contingent upon respect for the peace agreement preserved and preventing a return of a hard border. Johnson must be absolutely exasperated to find the US is ready to impose conditions on a trade deal, having raised tensions in Northern Ireland on the pretext of reclaiming sovereignty. Taking back control was supposed to mean we could do what we wanted. The government is also short on benefits for taking back control. It's been making them up. It's been seduced by its own Brexit propaganda. Take back control, get Brexit done. The Conservatives have gained an 80-seat majority and now see themselves as parliamentary sovereignty even when their election promises crumble. Parliamentary sovereignty fulfilled by Brexit ideology is starting to look like a monarchical sovereignty. Our unwritten constitution relies on governments respecting the sovereignty of Parliament. Placing our sovereignty in Johnson's hands is like handing lit fireworks to an arsonist in an oil refinery. For Johnson, taking back control means avoiding scrutiny, breaking the law, and disowning all responsibility. All very reminiscent of the pre-Magna Carta days. In 1215, King's John Barons stopped the rot, but we had better wake up today. Today, the man who would be king is intent on confirming the Baron's worst fears. So, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I really can't say anything better than that. We are currently living in an almost worryingly time of complete and absolute Tory rule, basically brought on by an election that was designed to promise to, quote, get Brexit done, and then fulfill all those promises that the Leavers promised about Brexit, even the ones that they didn't somewhat, may or may not confirm. Because, like I say, if you come up north and you talk to these Brexiteers and the Brexit supporters, you will get one thing very clear, and that is they voted for Brexit because they were sure that the Brexiteers were telling them, people like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage were telling them, if you vote for Brexit, your life will become better. And that is not going to happen under this government. It is not going to happen at all. And anyone thinking that somehow Johnson is going to become benevolent and indeed, as they say, quote unquote, level up the North with the absolute pitiful amount that he has suggested so far to give, to the crumbs to levelling it up. And of course, with the very, very suspicious way that Rishi Sunak has now decided to distribute these funds to places of his own constituency, where even his own constituents are a bit puzzled as to why all of a sudden they're getting access to all this money when they clearly don't need it. When towns like mine, Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster, and even Sheffield are desperately crying out for actual investment. And like I say, sooner or later, the red wall that the Tories managed to break into is not going to hold them up. Because if they think that the people of the North are thickos, that they're going to keep on voting for them, they're going to get a very, very rude wake-up call. So, as always, thank you for watching. Please remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below there is a link to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, well, buy me a coffee. And thank you to all those people who do support me, and we'll see you all next time.